There are two types of state in a React application. There is the internal state of the app, which is managed by useState or useReducer. And then there is the external store state of the application, which would be managed by something like Redux, Valtio, Zustand, or MobX. And the connection between that external store state and the internal state of the app is critical to getting a high performance React app going. Now, with React 18, we have a new hook called UseSyncExternalStore that makes it much easier and more standardized to create this synchronization between an external store and the internal state of the React app. And understanding this hook will help you understand more about the performance of your application. So it's a good thing to look into. Let's get into it right now. Okay, so to have a look at this new hook, we are going to build two different types of applications. We're going to build a client-side rendering application, first using Vite, and then we're going to build a server-side rendering application using Next.js. And the reason we're going to do the server-side rendering one second is because there are some unique changes and challenges that are brought up by server-side rendering, or SSR. So it's a little bit easier to look at the CSR version first. Now, when we look into the CSR version, we're going to go and build our own state manager, which is super cool. You're going to understand how to build one, and we're going to understand how to connect that external state manager that we just built to our app. So let's create our Vite app and get started. Okay, I'm going to bring up our console, and then I'm going to run yarn create Vite, which is going to create a Vite app. We're going to call it CSR, and we're going to use a React template because we want to do React. Okay, now we have our CSR app. Let's go in there and we'll do yarn. And then we'll do yarn dev to launch our app. And look at that, bang, app. No wonder people like Vite so much. It's so fast to get started with it. Let's go take a look at this app and see what we have in there. We have an app.jsx file, which has a lot of stuff in it. And we'll just get rid of all that. Don't really need that to start. All right, looks good. And let's simplify this CSS a little bit. We'll add a little bit of padding on the outside. Make the font sizes extra large so we can see them. And we'll make it a sans serif family of font. And then for the button, we'll just make them extra large, just so we can see it. Okay, so let's go take a look at our app. And now we got a blank page. Very cool. So the first thing we want to do is build our store. So let's create a file called store.js, which is going to have our store in it. And we'll create a new function there, which is going to have our store creator. We'll call it create store. Now, any store is going to have an initial state. So let's define that that's the thing that's coming in, our initial state. And it's going to keep track of the state. So we're going to have a current state, which would be the new state of the system. And at the beginning will just be the initial state. And now this is going to return an object. And you're going to have three things in a store. You're going to have an ability to get the current state of the store, which would be get state. You're going to have a set state, which is going to set the state of the store, the new state. So it's going to take a new state and it's just going to equate the current state with the new state. And that third thing is going to be how we connect the store to the actual app, but we'll get there. So let's start off with just get state and set state. So the next thing I want to do is actually create that store. So I'm going to create a store using that create store. And let's just do two incrementers. So we'll have value 1 start at 0 and value 2 and start that at 0. And I'll export that as the default. So now we have our store. So now let's go connect that to our app. So we're going to bring in our store from that file. So I'm going to lay out our test app as a grid, a 2x2 grid. It's going to have buttons for the incrementer and then the value of the incrementer. So, whatever, pretty simple. And so in our first one, we're going to have the increment value button, and we're going to tell it which one to increment. So it'll be item equals, say, value 1 would be the first one, and then value 2. Of course, we don't have this component, so let's go create it. So create increment value. It's going to take an item, and it is going to return a button. We'll just say something like increment, and then the item name. And on the click, what we're going to do is increment that item. So first we got to get the current state. So we'll get the current state from the store by doing get state. And then we need to increment that particular value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do store.setState. And we're going to use all of the current state and then override the key that we have, that item, to be the current value of that plus 1. And let's wrap that up. And I think we're good. Let's go take a look on our screen and see what it looks like. Hey, it looks pretty decent. So we've got these buttons, but now we don't know if they're actually doing anything or not because they're not actually displaying the value. So let's go and create another component called display value. So I'll drop that in there. So I'll create a display value for value 1, and I'll create a display value for value 2. So now let's go and implement on display value. So take display value, and we'll take an item. And this one's going to return a div. And in that div, we will say that this is our current value for that particular item. So we're going to get that state, and then we're just going to dereference that to that item. So get state, and then like value 1 or value 2. So let's try it out. I'm going to hit save and see what happens. So now what happens is we did a hot reload. So we're actually seeing that value 1, because I clicked that 3 times, is 3. And value 2 is 4 because I clicked that 4 times. Now, if I click on value 1 again, we would expect that this would update, but it doesn't because we haven't actually synchronized the React state with the state of the store. The store has changed, but our React app doesn't know about it. So what we need to do is create a connection between the React app and the store. So what we need to do is create a way for us to subscribe to that store and listen for any changes to that store. So we need to create a subscribe function on there. And that'll take a listener, which is a function that gets called back whenever the store changes. Now to track that, we need a list of all our subscribers. So we'll create a constant here called listeners, and we'll use a set for that. A set is just like an array, except that you can't have the same item in the array twice. And we're using that because we only want a particular subscribing function to be in the list of listeners once, so that when you remove it, it's all removed at one time. So now we add the listener to that list of listeners, and we also return an unsubscribe function. Now this has become kind of the standard in these pub/sub mechanisms. When you subscribe, you get back a function, which is your unsubscribe. It's actually a really nice, clean way of doing this. So the only thing left to do is actually send out the notification when things change. And the only time something changes is when you set the state. So that's the only place that we actually need to call these listeners. So let's turn this into a curly brace function. And in here, we're just going to iterate through all those listeners. And then with each listener, we will call that listening function with the current state. Okay, let's go take a look and see if anything is improved. No, it hasn't, because we're not actually calling the subscribe. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and create a custom hook that's going to connect our store to our application. So we'll go back in here and we'll create a custom hook called UseStore. And it's going to do 2 things. It's going to subscribe to the store, and then it's going to update the state when things actually change. Let's see if GitHub Copilot's done a good job here. And it looks like it has. Well, we have our state, and it's initialized to the initial state of the store. And we have a use effect that subscribes to our store and then calls setState whenever that store changes. Now, the only thing I think it's messed up on is that it actually hasn't imported useState or useEffect. So let's go do that, useState and useEffect. Now to do this, we need to use this wherever we display the value of the store. And that's the only place we do that is in display value. And what we're doing there is doing that store.getState, which is getting basically the snapshot of the store at that time of rendering, but isn't getting updated. So we're going to use our useStore in here to replace that store.getState, because this useStore is now returning that state, which has value 1 and value 2. And then we're just dereferencing it, just like we did before. So let's hit save and see how we go. All right, we have a cool functioning store and it works. But there is one extra little gotcha in here. And I'm going to show that by going over here to our inspector and then going to the React DevTools, So now I need to make sure that my highlight updates when component render is checked on. And I can go over here and click on increment value 1 and see that, sure, this updates, which is great, value 1 4 changes, but value 2 0 also updates, which it shouldn't because I'm not actually changing value 2. So what we need to do is figure out why that's happening. So why that's happening is over here. So we do a subscribe. We're getting all of the state for the application, which is an object that contains both value 1 and value 2. And then we are setting the state to that new object. And that is forcing a re-render. When what we really want to do is we want to be more surgical about this. What we want to do is use a selector. We want these components, for example, the value 1 display component, to say, all I'm looking at is value 1. It's then the same for value 2. All I'm looking at is value 2. And the way that we do that is by implementing a selector. So down here in the UseStore, we should be able to say that given the state, all we really want out of that is the state for my item, value 1 or value 2. And that's a selector. And where you implement a selector is in our UseStore. So I'm going to add on a selector here as an argument, and then set the standard implementation to take the state and then just return the whole thing, right? So in order to use this, we have to wrap any store.getState with our selector, and then our selector is going to basically pare down whatever we want from that store into that result that we're looking for. So selector around getState. And now down here in our subscribe, we're going to get given the state, and we are going to then set state with the output of the selector that we then give that state to. All right, let's take a look, see how we go. So increment that value, and now the only thing that updates when I increment value 1 is the display for value 1, and the same thing with value 2. So now the cool thing that's coming in with React 18 and is also shimmed in React 17 is this new hook, UseSyncExternalStore. And it basically does what this UseStore is doing for us. It takes three things. It takes a subscribe function, which we know, so that's the subscribe function of the store. It takes a get snapshot, which is getting the current state of the store at any given time. And then there's a third argument for get server snapshot, which we'll get to in just a bit. That's important for SSR. So let's just take a look at these first two. So let's go and replace this UseStore with UseSyncExternalStore. So we're still going to take a selector, but we're going to replace all of the implementation with UseSyncExternalStore. Now that first argument is the subscribe argument, and so we'll give it the store.subscribe. Now, why are we not calling store.subscribe? Well, when you call store.subscribe, you give it a function, and that function is what the subscriber is giving to the store to call it back, and we don't know what UseSyncExternalStore wants for that function. So we're going to give it the subscribe function, and it's going to handle the subscription for us, or for itself, really. And the function to get the state would be a function where we want to apply the selector to the store.getState. So we want to shim our selector in there to make sure that we get optimal updates. And let's save that out and see how we go. So let's hit refresh, and perfect. So this is actually doing all of the work for us that useState and useEffect was doing before, but doing it in a much more standardized way. So this is showing you exactly how your external store is synchronized with your React app. All right, now there is one complicating factor, which is server-side rendering. So in order to test that, what we need to do is use a Next.js app, because that's one of the frameworks that supports server-side rendering or SSR. So let's go back up a directory, and then we're going to do yarn create next app, and we'll call this one SSR. Okay, so let's go take a look at our SSR application. I'll cd SSR, and then do yarn dev, and bring that up. And we have our standard out-of-the-box next app. So let's go and pare that down a little bit, just like we did before. And also update the styles a little bit. Use the same styles we did over in the CSR app. Okay, good. So now we want to bring in our store. Now we can't bring it in the pages directory, so we've got to go create a new directory called source and then bring in our store. So just copy and paste that in there. All right, good. And over in our index, we kind of want to bring in exactly what we had before. So let's bring in app.jsx, copy all that, and let's actually paste it into our index.js. Okay, so let's take a look. So we've got UseSyncExternalStore. We've got the store. It's from the wrong location there. So let's go and change that. And let's take a look. Okay, so it kind of works, but it's actually throwing a rod on this UseSyncExternalStore. And the reason it's doing that is because what the Next.js folks have done is they've actually what's called monkey patched UseSyncExternalStore to change the API a little bit. Now in Next.js, that third argument, that getServerSnapshot, is now required. So in order to do that, the easiest thing in this case, because we're not actually using getServerSide props or getStatic props yet, is just to replicate the existing getSnapshot, that first one. Now let's take a look. And now that works. Does exactly the same thing as our CSR app. Now this isn't quite right because this getServerSnapshot should always return the exact same value. And that actually does work in this case because we're actually selecting down to primitive values. But if you're selecting to an object, this is not quite the right thing to do. So what we really want to do is we want to try to see how to route the state that we have coming out of the initial fetch of the application, the getServerSide props, and propagate that to our store. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is export a new function. It's going to be getServerSide props. And in a Next.js app, you just return a set of props, and we're going to set that to the initial state, where we'll say value 1, we'll just give it some random values, so 12, and value 2 is 14. Okay, cool. So now we've got our initial state down here, and we need to route it to our app, which is here. And you know what? We'll just start off by putting a console.log in here and make sure that that comes through. And there we go. And now we've got our initial state at value 12 and value 14. All right, let's get rid of that console log. And now we've got to figure out a way to route initial state from here all the way up to this UseStore. You can't just really do initial state like that. That's not really going to work. So the easiest way to do that would be to use context, right? This UseStore is a custom hook. It exists within the context of our application. Therefore, it has access to React context. So we can share it through a React context. So what we'll do is we'll do create context, and we will call this server context. And we really don't need a value because we're going to define that value right away down here in our app. So we'll do server context.provider and give it that initial state. And then we'll close it up down here. And there you go. Now we've got our initial state shared through this context. And now we just need to have it accessible over in our UseStore. So the way that we do that is we use that context. We'll use the useContext hook. And then down here in our store.getState, instead for the server-side rendering, we will just do useContext and then give it the server context. All right, so let's go take a look. And all right, we can see that value 1 is still 0 and 0, which is the initial state of the store. So why is that? Well, if we go take a look at view page source, it gives us a bit of a clue. So let's do a line wrap and we'll kind of zoom in here. And this is the response coming back from the server, the initial server side render. And what we can see is actually value 1 when we are doing the server render is actually 12 and value 2 is actually 14 at that time, because at that time, it's actually being fed off of this use context right here. The problem is that then the client side runs and the client side state is initialized to 0, 0. So then on the client side, this function, this snapshot is run, and that gives you 0, 0. So you start off at 12, 14, and then you go to 0, 0 on the client. So what we really need to do is initialize the store on the client as well. So to do that, we should go and create a new method, for an example, on our store, and we'll call it server initialize. And it will take a state and then set the current state to that state. Now, we don't really have any listeners yet, so there's no reason to call those listeners with that new state. We're just kind of setting the state right away. Okay, so let's try this out. We'll go back over here to our index. We'll go with the store, do server initialize, give it that initial state, and see how we go. All right, looks good. Now there is a little hidden gotcha here, and that's because this app, if it were to re-render, would reinitialize that store with that initial state. So we really only ever want to call this the once, and we can actually trap that on the store side by putting in a little flag here to say are reinitialized, and we'll start that at false. And then we'll only set the state if we are not initialized. And then we'll set that is initialized to true. And that makes sure that we don't ever get called twice. All right, well, there you have it, a walkthrough of this fascinating new hook, UseSyncExternalStore, which is available to you in React 18 as well as in React 17. I hope it gives you some insight about how external stores are synchronized with our React app internal state and why selectors are important. If you have any questions or comments, of course, please put those in that comment section down below. And if you like the video, hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit that subscribe button and click on that bell and you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.